My name is Douglas Russell. I have been, for better or worse, the curator of the Natural History Museum's collection of eggs and nests for approaching 25 years now. And the journey that I had to become the curator of eggs and nests is a slightly tortuous one, but what unifies it is that my honours project was on human skull collection at Edinburgh University, and I was attracted to working on that collection because it was being used as a vacuum cleaner store, and I was intrigued. I'd started going into the Royal Museum of Scotland when I was about 7 or 8. And we had a family friend who was the curator of the anatomical collections, so he used to allow me to go in after school. And it was the fact that that collection was being used as a vacuum cleaner store, that collection was not perhaps being given the scientific merit and the interrogation that it deserved. And I became really fascinated by that. And so, also having an interest in birds, also having an interest in natural history, I was drawn to eggs, because egg collections in museums have suffered, to a certain extent, the same fate as human remains, in that they became somewhat orphaned collections and were perhaps not being given the level of scientific attention that they deserve. And so that is the strange route by which I came to be the curator of eggs and nests. So a few years ago I was asked during the pandemic to start to think about writing a book, a public book, popular book for the museum as part of a series of books, all of which were called Interesting. I take no responsibility for the title of Interesting Bird Nests and Eggs whatsoever. I think it's a terrible title. And it was basically because the first book in this series was Interesting Insects, which I think is amongst the least imaginative titles I've ever heard in my entire life. Anyway, I was naive in my initial plan, and I thought that as an author one would get huge amounts of power. Turns out that you get no power whatsoever, and basically when your publisher turns around and says, I think we're going to call it that, you go, thanks very much, that'll be great. I'm more than happy to call it Interesting Birds, Nests and Eggs. I wanted to call it Interesting Nature of Nests, but they didn't like that because it didn't have eggs in the title, and apparently that would confuse people. So they wanted it to be super crystal clear. Both of these books, by the way, are the same. So Interesting Bird Nests and Eggs is published in the UK under the Natural History Museum. The Smithsonian Handbook of Interesting Bird Nests and Eggs is published in the US. So they are absolutely identical books. So what was the plan? The plan was to try and encompass as many of the bird families that the Natural History Museum has an example of an eggs and nest as we possibly could. And so I wanted to make it a phylogenetically broad sweep throughout the whole of the collection. And so we decided to, we now curate the collections to the Howard and Moore 4th edition of the checklist. And that recognises 236 separate families, of which I'm lucky enough to look after over 120 family examples within the Natural History Museum. Our egg collection and nest collection, the egg collection is much bigger than in the nests. There's about 300,000 clutches of eggs in total. Nest collection is much smaller, it's only about 5,000. That's still better than it was when I started. When I started, I was told there was 2,000 nests. When we first did our first database of the collection, it came out at 4,000, and I'm still going through and finding nests that were never catalogued, and I'm now at just over 5,000. I think there's probably easily another 1,000 nests in there yet to be catalogued. So one of the reasons for following Howard and Moore is that there's a lot of newly split out families. And that is quite interesting for me. It's quite interesting in terms of actually going through the collections and trying to work out what our representation was. So this is the book as it was planned. So the idea was to have the common name, Latin name down to the subspecies that this nest particularly was there to illustrate, a small account, and then a description of the nest size, clutch size, and most importantly from my perspective, who collected it, when and where. And that was a battle, putting it mildly. The museum very much wanted me to write a book which was generic. I was to write an account of a blue tit's nest. It was not to refer to a specific blue tit's nest, it was just to talk about blue tits nesting in holes and give a general example. I didn't want to do that, so I didn't. What I decided to do was I wanted to talk to one specific example, because what you look at with a nest is an example of behaviour. So I felt it was really important to treat the collections as we do with research, which is you look at one specific example and you speak to that. What does that tell you about that species? What does it tell you about birds in general? And I wanted to start with this quote, and this is because this is one of my favourite books in the history of ornithology and the history of the study of eggs and nests. And it's a book called The Architecture of Birds from 1831 by the eminent Scottish naturalist James Rennie. And at the start of that book he wrote, "We devote this volume to an examination of birds in the exercise of the mechanical arts of constructing nests. This work is the business of their lives, the duty which calls forth that wonderful ingenuity which no experience can teach and which no human skill can rival. The infinite variety of modes in which the nests of birds are constructed and the exquisite adaptation of the nest to the peculiar habits of the individual offer a subject of almost exhaustless interest." I couldn't have put it better myself. The point is that 2 centuries later, nests continue to be a study, a subject of almost exhaustless interest, which is a good thing because I've devoted the last 25 years of my life to it. So this is the earliest nest that we have in the Natural History Museum collections, or certainly that survives. It's collected in November 1768 in Rio de Janeiro on the first voyage of Captain James Cook on Endeavour. It's probably actually collected by either Banks or Solander. We don't know exactly which of them collected it. We know that Banks was actually only on shore for 1 day in that period in November 1768, whereas Solander was there on shore for a number of days. So it's probably more likely that it was actually collected by Solander. And for years that specimen has been on display in the King's Library, in the British Library, in the British Museum. And we recently rescued it, took it back off display, and it is currently sitting with my colleagues in conservation and will be coming back to Tring and back to the collections. But it was on display for 20 years, so I feel it's done its bit. So one of the things I just wanted to touch on is the paucity of knowledge and on bird breeding and how that is distributed. And if we look at well-known species for which there's a high amount of breeding information known, it won't surprise you to know that most of that information is going to be in the Western Palearctic, it's going to be in North America, and Greenland's surprisingly doing really well. Maybe while Donald Trump wants to take hold of it. And so is Antarctica, mostly because there's only 2 bird species that breed there. But when we come down to looking at poorly known species, it's the same areas that you would expect. So it's areas in South America, it's areas in West Africa, in areas in Indonesia. And I think the way to remember this is that across all bird species, about 30% of bird species, we have large amounts of information on their breeding. About 40% of bird species, we have 1 or 2 records. And then 30% of bird species, we have none whatsoever. So if you flick through the pages of Handbook of the Birds of the World, you will find large numbers of species for which there is no breeding information known at all. So the study of eggs and nests is still completely critical. And you cannot conserve that which you do not understand how it breeds. So this is a lovely example of a recently collected nest. This is the nest, the first ever collected nest of the critically endangered Sartome grosbeak. I think it's important to remember that museums continue to serve this very critical and unique role as the principal archivists of newly discovered specimens. So in 2023, the Naturalist Museum, working in partnership with local people in the Democratic Republic of Sao Tome and Principe, helped preserve that first known nest and bring it back to the UK. That was actually a long process just of collecting the nest and getting it sent back. It was, ended up sitting in Portugal for many months before we finally got it back to the UK. And the next thing is nests in a polluted world. So nests are now becoming ubiquitous in terms of an example of how mankind is ruining the environment. And the amount of plastics that we see in nests, of a recent study, with this study actually, Life in a Polluted World, about 11,000 nests studied, about 33% had anthropogenic materials, plastics, string, incorporated within them. But what I always like to try and point out to people that it's not necessarily that the bird's behaviour has changed, it's the nature and longevity of the rubbish that we leave around. Birds have been using our rubbish for as long as we've been leaving it about. That's a really nice example of a reed warbler's nest, collected on the 26th of July 1783 by the Reverend John Lightfoot. And you can see, it's one of my favourite illustrations in ornithology. You can see that the string that is being incorporated within the nest. Lightfoot unfortunately died shortly after he collected that at the age of 52, which is the same age as I am now. So I'm hopeful that the two are not linked. And this is the oldest surviving example of a nest with anthropogenic materials that I've so far found within the collections. This is a southern fiscal nest collected in South Africa in 1902. And you can see that it's got little bits of man-made cloth that has been incorporated into it. So, if we start taxonomically, we start with the Syrian ostrich. The reason I wanted to include the Syrian ostrich was because this egg was collected by a gentleman called Charles Doughty and was then gifted to a gentleman called T. Lawrence, also known as Lawrence of Arabia. And then Lawrence of Arabia in turn gave it to Colonel Richard Meinertzhagen, who then gave it to Walter Rothschild. And there's a little letter that goes with this egg that says that from Meinertzhagen, where he complains that Rothschild never seemed to appreciate its importance. So, why is it important? Well, we know relatively little about the Syrian ostrich and its breeding. Syrian ostrich are extinct. Syrian ostrich was formerly found in the Arabian Peninsula, and they were wiped out pretty rapidly after the First World War. And it was the availability of guns in Arabia straight after the war which allowed them to be shot out in very quick times. And that was largely because up until that period they'd been sustainably hunted, usually with bows and arrows, and then you give people the rifles, it's amazing how quickly they can wipe something out. But we know that they laid somewhere between 12 and 21 eggs in the winter, buried in the sand, and then with a surrounding narrow trench to allow water to run off. It's important to remember that even in the desert you get sudden influxes of water at that point. And then this is an egg that was accessioned in 1858. It's the egg of a dwarf cassowary. Dwarf cassowaries are found across the mountains of the east of New Guinea, and as well as New Britain. Nest made in a shallow depression within the buttress roots of large trees. And this would have been known, the birds knew the people knew the birds as the Marook. And this one was brought back by Captain Devlin of the ship Oberon, taken to Sydney, and then subsequently sent to London in 1858. This is our only nest of the sunbitten. Sunbittens are these strange heron-like birds found in the neotropics. It's a shallow, open saucer cup of mud reinforced with grasses and leaves. And the reason I like to show this one is that the Zoological Society of London first attempted to breed them in captivity in 1865, and they were having no luck whatsoever. And then they noticed that the birds were unsuccessfully trying to mix wet dirt with moss. And this led to the inspired decision to supply the captive birds with copious amounts of wet clay, mud and straw. And they rapidly constructed a flat mud nest on a pole about 3 meters from the ground. And that's somewhere they first bred in captivity. So it just shows you, as long as you know what it is the birds actually want, you can get them to nest in captivity. This is the rather beautiful little nest of Gould's frogmouth. Frogmouths aptly named for their large flattened bills and gaping mouths. It's a simple but rather beautiful platform structure. The 3 Podargus and Rigidopennis species, restricted to Australia, New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, all build stick nests with a simple cup. But the Batrachostomus species in Asia build these smaller cup nests of bark down, spiders' webs and lichens. That brings us on to Sabine's spinetail. And these are found throughout Central Africa. And like other swifts, they use their saliva to adhere twigs together in order to build this small hammock-shaped structure. And that illustration is that nest from April 1912. And again, just to sort of point out to you the struggles that one has as an author, my colleagues in publishing fought me tooth and nail in the inclusion of that illustration. They didn't think it was worth putting in there at all. To me, it's worthless without that illustration, to be perfectly honest. And I particularly loved the fact that it was so beautifully done at the time. So each nest is about 8 centimetres wide and each twig is carefully glued into place. And that one's collected in southwestern Cameroon by George Latimer Bates, and that's his illustration. White nest swiftlets. This is the last time that you'll ever see these 3 particular nests looking as they do today, because unfortunately a few weeks ago there was an accident and one of them was dropped and smashed to smithereens, which was a bit of a sadness, but these things happen in museums. The white nest swiftlet build these opaque white nests, and they're perhaps some of the most unusual in the whole of the avian world. You will most likely have heard of them as being the main constituent of bird's nest soup. So they are made entirely of saliva, and when you go to the cabinet and you open the collection and the cabinet in which these are stored, you can smell them. So this was collected back in now in the about 1862. There you go. Hummingbird nests. Hummingbirds only made by the females. The males don't take any part in the building of nests. This is probably the rarest, if not one of the rarest, if not the rarest of all hummingbird nests. This is the Juan Fernandez firecrown, critically endangered. One of 9 species of hummingbird now listed as critically endangered. The sexes both look very, very different. This is the male, that's the female. And because they look so completely different, they were actually once described as 2 different species. Only found on Robinson Crusoe Island in the Juan Fernandez archipelago in the South Pacific Ocean. And you can see that it's made mostly of the sort of reddish bits of the Dickinsonia tree ferns. And it's most commonly found attached to those to climbing ferns. But it's a really beautiful example. It's probably the only example of a Juan Fernandez firecrown nest in a collection anywhere in the world. Everyone always likes to see this because this is one of the emperor penguin eggs. There's only 2 species of truly Antarctic penguins, the emperor and the Adelie, with the Galapagos penguin being the most northerly. Whereas most penguins nest in burrows, rocks, rock crevices, or build nests of stones, the emperor has perhaps the most unusual method, the eggs being incubated on the father's feet. Female lays 1 egg in May to June, and in the mid-Antarctic winter. You'll notice that that is one of the 3 eggs collected on the worst journey in the world, with Apsley Cherry Garrard, Henry Bowers, and Edward Wilson. So you'd be hard fought to find anything more tough to get hold of in the entire Natural History Museum collections. There was 5 weeks they spent with an average temperature of minus 42 degrees centigrade. And I always like to tell everybody the story about when Cherry writes in the book that when the temperature had got down to about minus 60, when he came out of the tent at one point, he took a deep breath in and it split his teeth instantly. It just shattered one of his teeth, which I can't imagine that happening, but I would imagine that's pretty painful. So this is a nest of a golden plover in a box. Just to be clear, golden plovers do not nest in boxes. This is they share a lifelong pair bond. The male makes a shallow scrape and lines it with moss, lichens and other plant materials into which 3 or 4 eggs are laid. So when this was found in 1884, or since this was found in 1884, there's been a sharp decrease in the bird's range across Europe. And that's mostly, we think, down to climate change. The difficulty for golden plovers is that the timing of their breeding is very much linked to tipulids, so cranefly. What we're beginning to see is a disconnect, an asynchrony between the emergence of tipulids and the laying of eggs. And if that continues, that causes a major problem. There was a lovely paper by James Pierce Higgins based on BTO nest records looking at climate change and golden plover about a decade ago. And I've tried to persuade them for ages to actually use the egg collection to extend that paper backwards and to try and get a better grip on exactly how much asynchrony is now occurring. So this is the nest of a red-necked phalarope. Sandpipers generally prefer exposed wetland breeding habitats, and most are intertidal. Phalaropes are unusual in spending most of the non-breeding season wintering at sea. So 6 months before this nest was built, they would have certainly been off the west coast of South America. So the letter is written the 4th of July 1899 and is placed with the nest, and it illustrates the rarity of them in Orkney at that point. This is the first one I ever found and the only one I have known to be found on mainland of Orkney, so I trust you will appreciate it and be pleased with it. That was written by John R. Gunn. You've also got to remember that there was a financial consideration to this in terms of rarity. The more you could explain the rarity of something, the greater the price that you could command for selling it. This is, I think it's a rather lovely nest of a brown noddy. So brown noddy are terns found in the tropics, breed in colonies in tropical locations. Like many seabirds, only lay a single egg. But in areas where there are trees, they can construct platform nests. But where there aren't any trees, they'll usually use an agglomeration of guano with shells, coral, twigs, bones, and even dead marine animals. The reason that I wanted to show you this one, this is collected on the 8th of November 1921 in St. Peter and St. Paul's archipelago, Central Atlantic, during Shackleton's final expedition. And although it's mainly of guano, there's a little note that goes with it to say that there was a bryozoan that was found inside it that had not been formally recorded at St. Peter and St. Paul's Rocks during the Challenger expedition about 40 years before. And I sat down with a colleague and we started to try and work out what species of bryozoan it was within that nest. And we came to the conclusion that it was a species that was actually found on the east coast of North America. And I cannot prove it, but I have a theory that the reason that it wasn't found during Challenger is because Challenger may have introduced it to the archipelago itself when it was there, and then it has grown vociferously since, and that was why they found it in being incorporated into the nests in 1921. I don't know how I'm going to prove that, but that's my working theory. This is the nest of a red-faced mousebird. Mousebirds, very highly sociable little birds, famous for their habit of running around looking like mice. It's a typical large, open, deep-cut nest with a foundation of dry thorns and lined with grasses. And they often take the opportunity to nest near wasp nests. And we see that repeatedly with birds, is that they can use that as a way of protecting their nest, is to try and find the most dangerous insects they can in the local area and use those as protection. They'll also use the nests of other species like Cape sparrows and pull those apart, rob the materials, and then use that to make their own nests. This is a rather lovely example of a buff-spotted woodpecker nest. You will expect, obviously, that woodpeckers peck wood and that they are mostly nesting in holes in trees. But a number of species of woodpecker will also use arboreal termite nests. So especially in areas where the number of trees are low or there's a lack of other options, they will use cacti or termite nests. So this one was collected in the early 1900s, and it was actually used to illustrate the Bannerman's birds of tropical West Africa. So you can actually see that that nest there is that one that's used in the book. Dead nests are very rarely used. We also see this behaviour in kingfishers, parrots, trogons, puffbirds, and one of the cotingas. The reason that they don't tend to use dead nests is because a dead termite nest rapidly begins to fall apart. If they're not being given regular attention by the insects, then they can be pretty fragile. This is a log in the collections, and it's a nest of the red-fronted tinkerbird. The tiny red-fronted tinkerbird is considered part of the wider family of toucan barbets, barbets and toucans. And like many of the relatives, they nest in holes that they excavate out of dead wood. And this one was actually in a rubber tree, but they often nest in figs, frangipanis and acacias. And you can see there's a tiny 2 centimetre small entrance which leads to a small chamber where the 2 eggs were laid. And actually, if you look carefully, there's a small remains of a nail. And the reason that that nail is there is because that is where the collector had used his knife to prise the branch open, and then he's used that nail to reseal it again after he'd taken the eggs out. I love these sort of little tiny bits of like remnants of people's activities in terms of collecting. This was another one that I had to 100% fight my colleagues in publishing for because they thought this was rubbish. They thought this was completely uninteresting and basically turned around and said, it's a test tube, Douglas, with some bits in it. And I said, it is a test tube with some bits in it, but it's a test tube with some really interesting bits in it, so that's why we're going to include it. So these 2 eggs in the nest litter from the burrow of the black-headed bee-eater taken in Nigeria. The birds were only discovered in this region in January 1980, and this was the first time that their nests had ever been scientifically described. 8 nest holes were found, each with a 38 to 65 centimetre long burrow, dug into the shallow ditch. And at the nest site, they were observed taking hawk moths and cicadas with some butterflies and beetles. But when you look at the nest litter itself and you start to get an entomologist involved and start going through that, then you could work out that the remains of carpenter beans, settling beetles, metallic flower beetles, rittling beetles, as well as honeybees and other wasp species in there. But that's why the collecting of nest litter alongside eggs is equally as important as trying to collect. You can't collect an entire black-headed bee-eater burrow. That would be quite a complicated thing to do. But you can take the nest litter out of it, and there's a reason to do it. I'm giving you lots of examples of things that they didn't want me to publish. And this is another lovely example. This was described of, what is this, Douglas? This appears to be like a plastic thing with bits of wood in it. And I was like, that's exactly what it is. It is the nest remnants of an echo parakeet. And the echo parakeet of the montane forests of Mauritius is one of the greatest success stories of bird conservation. And I'm actually this is one of my favourite accounts in the whole of the book. In 1986, the species was heading for extinction with less than 10 individuals left. They were nesting in large trees, often with a horizontal branch at least 10 metres from the ground. And this small handful of seemingly inconsequential bits of wood and the remains of 3 eggs are the beginnings of the fight to save the echo parakeet. And it was dedicated monitoring and study of the last of these natural nest holes and a rigorous program to manage the wild population linked to an extremely successful captive breeding program that saved them. I think you'd be hard-pressed to find anything which looks less impressive but actually means a heck of a lot. And then the superb pitter. So this is the only ever collected nest of the superb pitter. Superb pitters are only found on Manus Island, the largest of the Admiralty Islands in northwest New Guinea. It's a typical sizable spherical nest with a large side entrance. And this is also a difficulty when it comes to looking at nests in the museum. This guy is laid on its back in a box. And so when we initially got it out for the photography, the photographer and I were disagreeing over how it should be placed, because he thought it was a cup nest and therefore should be put on its back. And I was trying to point out that no, it's a domed nest, there's a side entrance, and then we were trying to work out from the way it had been in the box, which was the top, which was the bottom, and how it would have looked in life. And I think that that is an important thing to remember, is that these are not necessarily as they would have looked in life. Nests change dramatically in collections. The plant materials become brown. They are misshapen. They're forced into the wrong box. And sometimes it can be really tricky, so working with museum collections, to try and work out, especially if you've never seen that particular nest in the wild, what the heck it's actually supposed to look like. And that gets increasingly difficult when you've only ever had one that was ever collected. Then it becomes a sort of a question of going back through the literature and trying to sort of like work out what it was that the person who found it described, and then match that with what we have left. But what you're looking at is a crime scene. You're looking at something which needs interpretation. You have to go back and try and work out how would this have looked in life. So, yeah, it's a mass of rootless mosses, twigs and decaying leaves to construct the main part of it, and then the interior lined with rootlets. And in the early 2000s, the superb pitta was not found at areas where it was formerly present, or was found at very low numbers. When this nest was found in 1913, there were at least 29 birds were found, but now logging intense pressure from a growing human population and threats from introduced cats and dogs are perhaps their greatest threats. This is a nice little nest of a green and black fruit eater. The cotingas include some of the most varied and colourful birds of tropical Central and South America. One of the most important ornithological collections that we hold from the Central Andes was brought back by the naturalist Thomas Knight Salmon, and there's a very small number. In 1878 he brought back a series of 163 nests and eggs from Colombia, including this one, and actually they're all still quite nicely labelled up, and we've never quite worked out what his individual numbering meant, what it linked to. It's still in my system of trying to work it out. I suspect it probably links with, I think that he wrote up a number of these in Ibis, so I wonder whether it's part of his writing up in Ibis at that point. So that nest remains one of the few fruit eater nests known to science. It's also interesting to look at how it's put things. Mosses are incredibly important to nests, and what they allow is for it to be free draining. It's really important in a tropical rainforest that a nest doesn't become waterlogged, because being waterlogged is going to kill your eggs pretty rapidly. So if it gets cold, it still allows it to be thermally beneficial, but it also allows it to be free draining. This little guy is the nest of the scissor-tailed flycatcher. I was under a lot of pressure when I was writing the book to put in more examples of North American birds. I kept pointing out that I was trying to write it taxonomically, therefore I wasn't trying to concentrate on any particular area. I was trying to make it as global as I possibly could. But in order to get them to sell more copies in North America, they wanted more North American species. Because apparently if you're North American, you're only interested in North American species. It's sort of like a American bird first thing, I guess. Tyrant flycatchers have one of the most diverse nesting architectures, but many species build open cup nests, with others building globular or domed nests, and some nesting in cavities, most being short-distance migrants. The female that built this nest in 1860 would have been in the wintering grounds in southern Mexico and Central America in March, and arrived in Oklahoma, where this was collected in early April. Nests commonly include cudweed and catkins and post-oak catkins, and actually this is the subject of, you can see that's the post-oak catkin there. I was really stupid when I was writing my first version of the account here, because I became really excited and thought that that was an example of woven wool. And so I thought, okay, this is great. This is my earliest example of a nest with anthropogenic materials in it. And I had written my account, put it into the book, and then I was working with a postdoc from California, and she looked at it, and I said, oh, it's really exciting because it's got these bits of woven wool in it. And she went, oh, that's really funny because they look really like post-oak catkins. And I was like, oh, okay, is that a post-oak catkin? And she went, yes, that's a post-oak catkin. And I had to very rapidly rewrite that section of the book to say that this was not our earliest surviving example of anthropogenic materials. And we've also got a number of examples in the collection of what are now extinct species or subspecies. This is the nest of the San Cristobal vermilion flycatcher. In 2016, the San Cristobal vermilion flycatcher was described as the first avian extinction of the Galapagos Islands. It's a shallow cup of twigs, grasses lined with down and feathers. And it may not look very exciting. San Cristobal is the easternmost island of the Galapagos archipelago and the fifth largest. And during the South Sea Zoological Expedition of Pinchot in 1929, the birds were recorded as plentiful, but by the 1980s they were rare. And the last confirmed records of the species for the island dated to the 1980s. Research in 2019 showed that people may have encountered them up between 1978 and 2016, but now it's almost certainly lost. So there's that, and a couple of other examples are all that remain of that bird breeding on San Cristobal. This is probably one of the most iconic nests in the collection. It's the very famous nest, the Rufus hornero. Most phanarids build enclosed nests, but the way that they achieve that differs dramatically across the whole of the bird family. And this is perhaps the ultimate expression of building an enclosed nest. This adobe mud structure. The nest is about 3 to 5 centimetres thick walls with some dung and dry grasses incorporated. And it can take anything from 2 to 12 weeks to build. And with the entrance orientated away from the prevailing wind, the nest chamber is then lined with grasses. You have to remember that if you scale that up to the size of a human being, it would be like us building a 3-metre tall structure, which is got 50 centimetres thick walls with nothing but your mouth. So, you know, just bear that in mind. They can be very eclectically placed all over the place. There's one lovely example of them being built on the top of a bleached skull of a large mammal. This goes back to what I was saying earlier about the difficulty of imagining what a nest, a historical nest, looked like. So this is our only nest of the Albert's lyrebird. And the rarer of the two lyrebird species, restricted to wet forests in Queensland and New South Wales. Very little is known about their breeding, but this nest was described by John Gould in 1853 and was the first known to European science. That's his illustration in the Proceedings of the Zoological Society. And Gould described the nest. The nest was oven-shaped in form, outwardly constructed of roots, tendrils and leaves and palms, and lined with green mosses. It was about 2 feet in length by 16 inches in breadth, domed over except at one end. The eggs, barely 2¼ inches long or 1¼ inches wide, are of deep purplish chocolate, irregularly blotched and freckled with a darker colour. In a letter to Gould, the collector wrote, "It gives me much pleasure to forward to you the nest and the egg of Menura alberta." That is how it looks today. It has been squashed flat, putting it mildly. And it's only if you really look at it carefully you can begin to understand how it once looked. Quite how it's been squashed that flat, I've not worked out. Somebody seems to have put something very heavy on top of it at some point and left it there for a very long period of time. This is the nest of South Island saddleback. The Kokokos saddlebacks and the extinct huia all have wattles at the base of the bill and were once common across New Zealand. This South Island saddleback nest was built by the female alone in a natural cavity. Twigs and leaves were brought together and loosely bound together. This one is from Takepurua, Stevens Island. It's a small mountainous island, only 3 kilometres from the South Island in the north. Today it's basically a ghost town, but 130 years ago when this nest was collected it was alive with at least 12 bird species which are no longer found there. It's perhaps most famous for the sad loss of the world's only flightless passerine, the endemic Stevel Island wren, in 1895, which was notoriously linked with a single cat belonging to the lighthouse keeper. Just to be clear, it wasn't a single cat, and it wasn't called Tibbles. That cat, that's Errol Fuller in his book, maintains it was a single cat called Tibbles. That's not actually true. What happened was that there was a number of cats that were brought to the island during the building of the lighthouse, and then the lighthouse keeper had a series of cats which over the course of 2 or 3 years wiped out the entire population of Steven Island wrens. This is a rusty pitahui nest. The whistlers and narrows are all found in Australasia, with a few species in the Indo-Malayan region. They're all characteristic bulky lined cups of woody vine sticks, dried leaves and rootlets. The name pitahui is used for several morphologically similar but quite distantly related birds, which we know form an ecological rather than an evolutionary related group. It's an onomatopoeic name from a Papuan term which means rubbish, and several of the pitahuis, like the blue-capped tephritta, produce a powerful neurotoxin in their feathers which makes them inedible. So the name is likely to be a reference to their unpleasant taste. This is a rufous-naped bellbird nest. The 3 Australo-Papuan bellbirds are aptly named for their rhythmic songs. And like their close relatives, the whistlers and their allies, they all build open cup nests in the forks of trees, primarily of moss, barks, leaves and rootlets. The closely related crested bellbird of Australia builds a similar deep cup nest, but unusually they have the habit of adding poisonous caterpillars to their nests, which are often alive but paralysed, frequently adding these along the rim. It's yet to be shown whether the rufous-naped bellbird does exactly the same thing. But these Australian caterpillars obviously produce pain-inducing venom, and some have evolved this biological defense, including irritative hairs and toxins that make them poisonous to eat. And Chisholm, when he was first reporting on this behavior in 1918, noted that when threatened, the chicks stretch out their necks and wave their heads in the same manner as the tails of processional caterpillars. So whether or not they have learnt that as another method of... this is another example of the Pio nest. The Pios are extinct birds of New Zealand. There's a very small number. We've got 2 of their nests in the collections. But their relationships to the rest of the passerines have been hotly debated for a long time, but it's just been worked out by the genetics that they are in fact most closely related to the orioles. And there's only 6 of their nests are known, and we've got 2 of them in the Natural History Museum. And it's one of those things where we can only assume that this is a typical example. The exact history of this one is unclear, but the handwriting on the label matches that of a South Island saddleback nest, and we think that it's probably collected by the same people on Stevens Island as the nest that you've just seen. And actually I think that the handwriting on it is very childlike, and we know that the lighthouse keeper's son supplemented his income by collecting some bird specimens and then selling them on. Boulton's Batis is a nice example of a nest which came in during my period. So this was 31 of the wattle eyes and Batises found in sub-Saharan Africa. And this is the first time that their nest of the Boulton's Batis, Margaret's Batis, was ever found. It's a small cup-shaped nest in the fork of a sapling, and actually that picture, it's been amazing to, I feel like this was collected about 12 years ago now, something like that, and I feel like I've grown older with it. I've watched it come in a bright, vibrant green, and I've watched it gradually go brown over time. This is the nest of the endangered banded wattle-eye, only found in the Bamenda Highlands of Western Cameroon. Like a lot of nests, mostly held together using spider silk and bark strips. Between 1965 and 1985, huge amounts of their habitat on Mount Moko was destroyed. And BirdLife International and the Cameroon government have helped protect the remaining montane forest, and community-based conservation has been extended to try and help them. Roberto, you asked if I had any examples of nests from Mauritius. This is the rather lovely blue vanga. Blue vanga is perhaps one of the most extraordinary birds of Madagascar. Wasn't formally described until the 1970s, so this example, collected in the 1920s, is almost certainly the first known to science. One bluish egg. Again, you can see it's been very, very carefully decorated with huge amounts of lichen material. Blue-capped Ifrita. Ifrita was one of the most unusual birds. It's its own unique little family. They've also evolved the ability to sequester batrachotoxins into their diet, and the dietary source of the toxins is unknown. But both the Ifrita and the Coracine beetles are in the local area are called the same thing, which is Nanisani. And it's a lovely example where, because both the birds and the insects have the same effect, the local people have called them exactly the same thing. Greater bird of paradise. Everybody always likes to see this because it's a greater bird of paradise nest. It's also a brilliant example to illustrate how slender the branch on which our knowledge is based. perhaps one of the most iconic birds ever discovered. But this is the only nest of the greater bird of paradise that's ever been collected. It was collected by a chap called Wilfred Frost. When it was found in the mid-1920s, they were still under huge threat from the feather trade. And thousands of years of trading their feathers had emphasized the most extraordinary commodity, which was the plumes. And that's why they're called birds of paradise. Legless skins, together with sailors' accounts, led the Spanish court secretary to conclude a certain most beautiful small bird never rested upon the ground nor anything that grew upon it, but they sometimes saw it fall dead from above the sky. They call them birds of God. And I'm going to finish with this one. This is the rather boring-looking nest of a house sparrow. But house sparrows are, because of their names, incredibly linked with man, and they are one of the most flexible bird species in terms of their choice of site for nests. And this one I like to show people because it perhaps illustrates more than any other the flexibility of their abilities to choose a nest site. It was found in the exhaust pipe of a Royal Air Force helicopter at the beginning of the Iraq War, known in the UK as Operation Telic. And house sparrows are one of the commonest birds in Iraq. The female sparrows prefer holes and nest sites, but they will often go to any available niche in a building. So this is collected in 2003, and they're remarkably tolerant to disturbance. There's a story that comes in with that with how that nest came into the museum and what happened to it afterwards. But I will leave that to tell you over dinner if anybody wants to know. But I hope that that's been vaguely interesting, and I apologise for my length of time and my ever-decreasing voice.
Thank you very much indeed, Douglas, for that remarkably comprehensive insight into the nesting habits of birds. I think very nicely illustrated by the sheer diversity of the nature of the collecting that has gone into producing the Natural History Museum's collections. Quite an extraordinary diversity of people in different places, some suffering unbelievable hardship. As the example of the worst journey in the world, the emperor penguins. If anyone here has not read Absolutely Cherry Garrard's book, do read it for a quite extraordinary insight into the length it is possible to go in order to collect natural history specimens to prove or disprove a point about the links between reptiles and birds, which by the time the sort of analysis came about of the embryos within had been disproven anyway. But nevertheless, a wonderful legacy. We've time for a small number of questions because we have to be sure we're downstairs in time for those who are eating at the appropriate time. Could I throw the floor open? Roberta?
Thank you, Douglas. Amazing. Awesome. And thank you for bringing back to life these historical examples. I'm interested in the future. So what does the future of the egg collection look like? So what is, I imagine that you are also burdened with the legislation side of things for the protection of birds and nests and things like that, so it's difficult to acquire new collections and develop the existing collection. But what are your thoughts in terms of, as the person that looks after this collection, what happens next in the next episode of it?
So we take every opportunity that we can to add specimens to the collection through passively. So if there are opportunities where we can, for example, with white stork, that Laura has been looking after for the last few years. White stork have not bred in the UK for 600 years. and we had our first English-laid white stork eggs last year for the collections. And I hesitate to add that these were failed eggs, not ones that, so there's that opportunity. The other thing is that there's still an awful lot of historical egg collections out there with data, and we get offered about one egg collection a day. I turned down 90% of the egg collections offered because they don't have sufficient data, but we will, we take on somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 clutches a year. With nests, there's more of an opportunity sometimes, as there was with the Sao Tome grosbeak, to try and, when opportunity arises, and people, especially within the community, will let you know when they found something. Obviously, that nest, we waited until the birds had used it and finished with it, and then it was collected, and it gave us an opportunity to write a more detailed account of their nesting afterwards. But I spent most of last summer running around the country trying to get hold of cigarette bins. The reason I did that was because there's I think a problem at the moment with blue tits nesting in wall-mounted cigarette bins, and nobody was publishing on that or recording it. And part of my job as a curator is to illustrate the current situation. And in the same way that a librarian will take recent books, I think it's imperative that we take things that in 100 years or 200 years' time will be looked back on with horror, I think. And the fact that I think the reason that we've seen a slight increase in the number of reported cases of blue tits nesting in cigarette bins is because before the smoking ban, wall-mounted cigarette bins weren't really a thing outside of places. Now that they're everywhere. But with the increase in vaping and a decrease in smoking, then it's leaving those boxes open to being prospected by the birds.
I think it's worth emphasising that the nest, the Natural History Museum never set out to get a nest collection. It accumulated them and unfortunately disposed of many, which now would be considered very interesting.
It did dispose of some of it, but also we're not quite clear. We know that for many early accessions of nests, from about 1840 through to about 1880, 1890, about 90% of nests have gone.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay.
Douglas, obviously specimens of birds and eggs are subject to import and export regulations with the biodiversity conventions. Does this also apply to nests?
No.
Andy, and this is the last question.
Apart from not putting encyclopedias on top of them, are there any other particular things you do to try and preserve them and save them from rot and decay?
So I spent this afternoon writing a book chapter on the conservation of nests. Basically you treat it like a botanical collection, so it's the same thing, trying to keep it sort of out of the reach of pests. Nests are particularly attractive to insect pests because that's their natural home. Also, we now have a bigger problem. So it's been a very long conversation with my colleagues in conservation to try and work out how we save these nest boxes in cigarette bins, these cigarette bins with nests inside, because I don't want to take them apart. I want to keep the entire cigarette bin intact with the nest inside it.